ATHEENAPANDIAN Private Limited and International Fovias Biomedical. It's a great honor to have with us a distinguished guest, Mr. Jim Talbot, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs, Quality Assurance, and Clinical Affairs at BIOMEDICAL. Mr. Jim Talbot has an impressive 35 plus experience in the medical device industry, working with small, mid-size, and large companies. His career begins at Hewlett Packard as a reliability engineer, and since then he has held several key leadership roles. He has worked with renowned organizations like Accussion, Novastep, Cutera, Boston Scientific, Restoration Robotics, View Ray, and ZAP Surgical System, where he held significant projects like achieving CE certification for Linux-based radiosurgery system under the EU MDR. Currently at QApple Medical, Mr. Jim Talbot continues to lead and expand the commercialization of their neurovascular catheter family, with recent CE certification accomplishments and OUS submission for new market in LATAM and APAC regions. In addition to his professional achievements, Mr. Jim Talbot holds a BA in Physics from SUNY Potsdam and an MS in Physics from Sakura University. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Jim Talbot. We look forward to hear your insights and learning from your vast experience in the field of medical device regulatory and quality affairs, sir. Welcome, sir, for this. On behalf of ATHEENAPANDIAN Private Limited and International Fovias Biomedical, we welcome you, sir.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I appreciate it. And good evening to my friends and colleagues on the other side of the ocean. As mentioned in the intro, I've been working in medical devices now for a little over 35 years here in Northern California. So I've worked for very large companies like Siemens and Boston Scientific, as well as mentioned, smaller and mid-sized companies, always in the quality and regulatory field, and more recently with clinical affairs. Just a little bit of background, since we're here talking today about the EU MDR, and more specifically, we're talking about the post-market clinical follow-up requirements under the EU MDR, and what we can all take away as best practices. For those of you who are either in the medical device industry or intend to join the medical device industry, I think it's good to give a little recap up front. And I'd like to say that I've been fortunate enough to work for companies that pioneered the way into the EU MDR. As mentioned, I previously worked for a company called ZAP Surgical Systems that made a very large radiosurgery system. If you can imagine, the patient will lay on a table, the table would move inside of a sphere, and the system would treat tumors in the head, neck, and brain using a linear accelerator. And the patient's movements would be monitored with an X-ray system so that accuracy could be maintained within a millimeter. Very important, the precision of treatment is highly accurate, since obviously you wouldn't want to expose healthy tissue to the linear accelerator, to this energy. So at ZAP Surgical, we were able to achieve CE certification with the notified body BSI. And we did that with a combination of a literature survey of similar devices on the market, and also using some retrospective clinical data that we had generated here in the United States. Subsequent to that company, I actually helped another radiosurgery company in Edmonton, Canada, achieve CE certification to the EU MDR. Again, a very large radiosurgery system using a linear accelerator, but in this situation, they used a MRI system, a magnetic resonance imaging system, to track the patient's movements during treatment, and again, make these very fine adjustments to ensure that the treatment beam was always, targeting the desired tissue, the tumor. And that I bring this up because that company used a combination of literature survey information on state-of-the-art products, similar devices or systems, but they had no patient treatment data whatsoever. This system was only available in a university hospital, and at the time there was only one such system in the world, and it was only being used to gather information on the imaging accuracy of that system. Very important that you understand that under the EU MDR, if you can demonstrate equivalence for a Class 2B system such as this, patient treatment data is not necessary for your initial certification. But the bar to clear to demonstrate equivalency is very, very challenging. So it's not easy, but that company was able to achieve certification without ever having treated a patient in the EU. So now we move to my current company, which is Capel Medical. We make neurovascular catheters that treat acute ischemic stroke and hemorrhagic stroke in the carotid artery. So this is a Class 3 device in the EU, and obviously it's a high-risk device. The device is inserted into either the radial artery in the wrist or in the femoral artery, and it's manually pushed up through the artery across the aortic arch and up the left carotid artery into the neck, and then further on into the M1, M2 regions, depending on where treatment is desired. But the intent there is that we could go in and actually remove clots that may be impeding blood flow, or insert a stent to reperfuse or reestablish what we call recanalization, or slide. So today we're going to focus on the PMCF, but I think everyone needs to be aware that the EU MDR is a challenge in place. The MDR requires a host of post-market surveillance activities, and the most challenging, of course, is the clinical evaluation report. And then there's a number of other reports required, such as post-market surveillance plan. There's a SSCP, a summary safety and clinical performance report. And finally, there's all of these now are new to the EU MDR and make our lives more challenging, because as you can imagine, for smaller companies to generate all of these reports for the notified bodies. So here at Capel, we work with DQS, another notified body, and we also work with TÜV Süd, both notified bodies out of Germany. We've achieved EU MDR CE certification with TÜV Süd, and we are currently working on a project with DQS to achieve CE certification for another family of catheters. So first of all, I'd like to start out by saying, here on this slide, you can see there are two primary references for the post-market clinical follow-up. One is the EU MDR itself, Annex 14, and I give you the specific location of that information, which is on page 165. And then there's a medical device coordination group, MDCG 2020-7, which is extremely helpful for folks that haven't had a lot of experience generating these PMCF plans. And I'm going to reinforce throughout this short presentation. When you initially apply for a CE certificate to a notified body, you don't need to have a PMCF report. You need to have a PMCF plan. And you'll see why in a minute. It's not necessary to have the actual report at the time of submission for your application. Next slide. So if we take a look at the MDCG, the purpose of the PMCF plan is really all about safety and performance, clinical benefits throughout the device's lifetime. So very important that upfront in your plan, you identify what are the safety and performance endpoints that are going to establish your acceptance criteria for the device's safety and performance. So, we'll talk a little bit more about this. You also need to identify any previously unknown side effects and monitor. So all devices have known side effects, and those are generally listed in your instructions for use, your IFU. But during the course of collecting clinical data, you're going to oftentimes discover that there are unknown side effects that you did not anticipate. Those need to go into your PMCF as well. Any new risks that you may have observed from actual patient treatments should make their way into the PMCF. And the most important output from the PMCF is the acceptability of the benefit risk ratio. This is really, really important, and the notified bodies key in on this. You need to have a discussion at the end of your PMCF and also at the end of your clinical evaluation report on the benefit risk ratio and why the device is acceptable. And then, of course, you're always going to find off-label use of your product, and you need to ensure that you continue to update your intended purpose. If you find that there's significant off-label use of your product, then perhaps you should maybe didn't consider all of the possible uses for the device. Next slide. So there are different types of PMCF activities. You could use a device, you could do what's called a registry, and you can either do it with your own device, or you can do it with similar devices, state-of-the-art, that perhaps are already registered in a national registry, and you can collect data that way. So that's a very formal and very expensive method of gaining clinical data. Most smaller companies would never do a registry, but very large companies, Johnson & Johnson, Medtronic, Intuitive Surgical, Boston Scientific, of course, would use registries. Smaller companies will do a PMCF study where you'll have a very specific plan, and oftentimes it'll be prospect criteria and your safety and performance endpoints up front. Very important that you will give a justification or rationale for performance and safety. And again, the notified bodies are looking for statistical significance when you determine your sample size range. To just talk, to take a look at a couple of formulas that are commonly used to determine sample size. The note that you define sample size requirements, and that you use a statistical method based on confidence and reliability, which is very similar. And, again, very important, the data should be of sufficient quality and come from reliable data that aren't acceptable to the notified body. And we'll take a look at those in a minute. And finally, you can also do a survey to collect information. Users of your device actually talk directly to physicians that use your device and collect information that way. Now, important to understand, there's also retrospective data collection, and smaller companies will most commonly use retrospective data because it's much easier to obtain. So you would work with a friendly physician who the company works with on a regular basis, and you would establish up front how many patients you'd like to gather information for. And that facility would provide you a large Excel spreadsheet. Of course, with HIPAA requirements involved, you wouldn't get patient names, but you'd all of the patient identifiers would be redacted, but you would have the important information related to performance and safety in that table. And then you would use that to summarize and create a post-market clinical follow-up report. And you would also use it into your clinical evaluation report. Very important that you understand that under the EU MDR, you're going to feel like you're going in circles. The information that you gather from one report will be leveraged in 3 other reports. So the same information that you'll use in your clinical evaluation report will be summarized and found in your PMCF report, will be found in your SSCP and your PSUR. Next slide. So if we look at MDCG 2020-7, it's very nice. It tells you exactly what information should be in your PMCF plan. So here you see a summary of the information that the notified body expects to see in your PMCF plan. I should point out there's also an MDCG 2020-8, and that is for the PMCF report itself. So initially, you're going to want to create this PMCF plan, and for that, you will need to make sure all of this information that I list here is included in your plan. Next slide. Now, the EU MDR, and this is a really important statement that's made in the EU MDR with respect to clinical data. So if you read this carefully, it says manufacturer shall proactively collect and evaluate clinical data from the use in or on humans of a device, very important, which bears the CE mark and is placed on the markets, meaning the European market, with the aim of confirming safety and performance, just like the MDCG. So the reason I point this out is you cannot have a clinical, you cannot have prospective clinical data on the use of your device when you submit for the CE certification, because your device does not yet have the CE cert. So your device could not have been placed on the EU market, and it does not bear the CE mark. Therefore, when you first submit your application to obtain a CE certificate, you should have a PMCF plan. You should have a clinical evaluation plan. You should also have a clinical evaluation report, but you will not have clinical data on patient treatment in the EU, because of course you can't. Your product hasn't been approved for use in the EU yet. It doesn't bear a CE mark. What you can have, and I've used it for several submissions, you can have data from the United States or another market where your product already has clearance. So most companies in the United States would first submit their product for US FDA clearance before they go outside of the United States. So by doing that, you gain clearance from the United States and can start using the device to treat patients here in the United States. That data that you gather can be used to bolster your PMCF and your clinical evaluation report when you make your submission to the notified body for CE certification. So I've done this. The notified bodies seem to like it. It gives them more confidence in the safety and the performance of your product when you have actual patient treatment data. And that's possible if you get a clearance in the US or one of the other markets before going to the EU. Okay, next slide. And again, the EU MDR is looking for the same information as the MDCG. So they're looking for the general methods that you're going to use to gather the information. They're looking for information on sample sizes. Are you going to use registries? Are you going to use studies? Most companies, as I mentioned, in the United States will do a clinical study, and that will feed into the PMCF plan and also into the clinicalness of the methods and procedures. Statistical confidence is required. There's no way around it. And we'll take a quick look at a few methods to provide that for relevant parts of the clinical evaluation report in your PMCF plan. So remember, we talked about the clinical evaluation report, PMCF, as well. Next slide. So the plan should have very specific objectives. For example, a radiosurgery system. A radiosurgery system should be used to reduce the size, the volume of it. Systems that's reducing the size of tumors in the head, neck, and brain. And you should be very specific in saying what percent reduction in volume objectives. Evaluation of clinical data relating to similar or equivalent devices. This is the best source of data for most companies. There are many, many publications in Google Scholar, in PubMed, in Prisma, in Pico. There's many tools that can be used to harvest publications on similar devices. So I would, recommend that anyone preparing to submit for CE certification do a literature survey up front. And then very important that you refer to any common specifications or harmonized standards that might apply to your device in your PMCF. And again, we talk about the type of data and the frequency that you should be updating this PMCF. It really depends on the risk of your product. So for my current company, we make these class 3 catheters that are used in the neurovasculature. Those require an annual update to your PMCF report and your clinical evaluation report, as well as your PSUR. Next slide. So your findings from your PMCF will make their way into the PMCF report. Also, and again, here we go, using the same information in many, many different documents, they'll also make their way into the clinical evaluation report. And all of these reports that we're talking about ultimately need to go into your TD. What under the MDD you used to call the tech file is now referred to as the technical documentation. All of these post-market surveillance documents need to reside in the technical documentation. And then very important, the conclusions of the PMCF report shall be in the clinical evaluation and also in the risk management. And oftentimes you'll find a need to update your risk management documents or implement corrective actions as a result of a clinical study or gathering clinical data. Discuss that in your PMCF. Next slide. So we talked about defining quality and quantity of data. So quality of data, very important, the data you're using. So if it's missing follow-up data for the patients following treatment, if that data is missing, then you shouldn't use that data. Obviously, veterinary studies should not be used if they're published outside of the include that data. Next slide. So again, many examples here of data that's not sufficient quality that should not be used in your. So I won't go through all of them, but you can review this as you have time. But this is just a quick, your post-market surveillance documents. Next slide. So now we get into how many patients should I treat? And this is, it's funny, this question's been open. And, you still find companies submitting clinical evaluation reports with, just at 5 sites in the United States with no explanation as to how did they arrive at 50 or 60 or whatever number. So they're actually very, very easy to apply. And here's one example here where if you know a particular metric related to your product, its performance, its effectiveness, and in the literature survey, you can find what's considered typical for state-of-the-art devices or similar devices, then you can use a formula such as this one to determine the minimum N or the minimum sample size to demonstrate, superiority based on a confidence level. So let's go to the next slide. So in this particular formula, you will notice I mentioned up front that for the device in question, we expected to achieve a 75% effective rate for the device. Whereas if you look at the literature, you would find that on average, similar devices are only achieving a 60% effectiveness. So now we have a delta here between what we think our device can do and what state-of-the-art similar devices have published they can do. So using those two numbers in that formula, we know Z alpha, we know Z1 minus alpha over 2. These are coming from the normal distribution. So we can, using 95% confidence, 80% power. And by the way, this is what notified bodies look for. Your study should always be powered at 80% with a 95% confidence level. So using those numbers, go to the next slide, you can plug in. I'm sorry, it was on the previous slide. The actual N turned out to be 80, which is a very reasonable number, certainly achievable in a short period of time. Here we have another example where we, again, have some metric for performance for in this case, a radiosurgery system that we say, the product should be able to achieve 95% treatment of the target volume. So 95% of the target volume should be treated by the linear accelerator's beam. So that is the P. And again, the Z score is, as we mentioned before, for 95% confidence, the normal distribution, 1.96. And E is the error that you're going to allow. So what error are you going to allow? For most sample calculations, an error of 5% is acceptable. So if we go to the next slide and you enter those numbers, you get a very reasonable N of 73 using the margin of error of 5%. So these are reasonable numbers. Everything we're seeing here is not unreasonable. It wouldn't take a long time to generate data for these sample sizes. Next slide. So another similar formula that's based on confidence and 80% power, comparing two different groups. In this particular example, we're going to use the proportion in group 1 that has a certain characteristic, and then we're going to look at that same characteristic in a second group, and that again, the delta, the detectable difference between the two populations is what's going to dictate your sample size. If we go to the next slide, if you enter those numbers, plug in the values, you will come up with I believe, a number of 90, a little bit more. Go to the next slide. Yes. So substituting those numbers into the formula, you end up with an N of 90.16. You always round up, so you would use 91 participants to ensure the 80% power for this particular sample size calculation. So here I just give you 3 examples. There are others available. You can certainly search this on the internet. I know a lot of people like to use Chat GPT. They will also give you formulas for calculating clinical sample sizes. It's amazing what's available on the internet these days. Next slide. So I'd like to give a little overview of what did we learn from our PMCF activities working with various notified bodies. So I mentioned this earlier. Gaining retrospective patient treatment data in the United States following the FDA 510(k) clearance is very, very powerful. Although it's not required up front when you submit your application to the notified body, it gives you confidence in the safety and the performance of your device, and that retrospective data is acceptable to the notified bodies in your clinical evaluation report. Because again, remember, you can't have data prospectively on patients treated in the EU because you don't have a CE cert yet. So this data is actually very, very valuable when you're first submitting for a CE cert under the EU MDR. And it's funny, these next few points I'm going to make seem very obvious, but you don't know how many companies submit their PMCF plan without defining safety and performance endpoints. It's probably the most important thing in your PMCF plan, but many notified bodies have indicated to me that that's the number one reason for rejection of PMCF plans and rejection of the technical documentation file, because adequate endpoints have not been established in the PMCF plan up front. With number 3, acceptance criteria. What is the minimum acceptance criteria you need to assure yourself that the test is intended? You should, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of data available on the internet literature where you can see the benefit risk analysis. If you don't have that, your PMCF will be rejected. And as I mentioned earlier, actual data from patients treated in a prospective study is expected after the device receives its CE certification. So after your device has been on the EU market for 1 year, let's audit, and they're going to do a clinical audit. During those audits, you should have prospective patient treatment data on patients treated in the EU. Next slide. So again, As I mentioned, prospective data may not be required if you have enough data from the clinical, and you won't need prospective data. As I mentioned, the company I helped get their CE cert in Edmonton, Canada, had no patient from BSI. And then again, how frequently you're going to update these reports is dependent upon the risk of your device. Class 3, you should have annual updates and you should have prospective data at your first surveillance audit by the notified body. Next slide. So there's a lot of sources for gathering this type of information, and I list a few of them here. You know, the FDA has a total product life cycle database. If you know the code, the 3-digit code that the FDA assigned, and we're talking about the US FDA, assigns to your product, then you can look up in the TPLC database all the similar products that have that same code and see how they're performing from a quality perspective. There's always the MAUDE database, which is a database of reportable adverse events. So this will help you with your patient safety analysis. And then there's similar databases in the UK, the MHRA database, and I give the links here for these various databases. Health Canada has one, Australia has one. I would encourage you to get familiar with these databases. It's really, they're very, very helpful, and too many people don't use them, but there's a lot of good information there. And in the next couple of years, this same information is going to be available in UTIMED, right, in the EU. So you'll be able to compare similar devices from the UTIMED database. It's not yet functional and active, but it will be, I understand, by 2026. Next slide. So notified body feedback on the different methods we talked about earlier. You know, it's funny, the endpoints for your PMCF plan are absolutely critical. And yet how many companies write a beautiful PMCF plan without identifying endpoints or acceptance criteria? It's surely going to result in rejection. And it's a little bit embarrassing that you would get that far and submit for a, you know, a technical document assessment and not have these criteria in place. So you must define the population to be treated. They also like to see a consideration of economic parameters. How much is this device going to cost? Not cost, how much are you going to charge for the device, but in terms of treatment time, is it speeding up treatment time compared to alternate techniques, alternate methods of treating the same condition? You should include clinician operator feedback. A safety evaluation obviously is very, very important. And then always the overall results and the conclusions and the benefit risk analysis is critical, absolutely critical. You have to have that in your PMCF. Next slide. So in summary, you just need a PMCF plan when you initially submit to a notified body for CE certification. If you have the luxury of first getting an FDA clearance in the United States, then you can gather retrospective data on patients treated in the United States. Now, the same could be done in India. You could gain clearance or approval in India, and that information could be used in your CER and your PMCF for your EU MDR submission. Statistical rationale, absolutely critical. I give you some examples there of formulas that can be used, that have been used and are accepted by the notified bodies. The PMCF report is required a year following the CE cert. So again, we talk about the device has to be on the market in the EU, treating patients in the EU. Well, that can't happen until after you've achieved your CE certification. Your clinical results have to be included in the CER and the technical documentation. And whenever there's new risks, you should update the risk management documents. Inevitably, you're going to find things during your clinical studies that you did not anticipate. It's good practice to go back and update your risk management. It's funny whenever you look at risk management documents, I don't care what the company is, and you look at the hazard analysis and you look at the, PFMEA, the UFMEA, the DFMEA, engineers typically underestimate the frequency or the likelihood of occurrence, right? Everything is improbable, remote, never going to happen. And lo and behold, you start shipping the product. And, in the first 100 devices you've shipped, you've seen it 5 times. So now it's frequent. So the notified bodies look at your complaint database and they check your estimation of frequency of occurrence, likelihood. It's very common, and you shouldn't be embarrassed about it, but it's very common for engineers to underestimate the likelihood for these things to occur. So it should be, a very straightforward update to your risk management documents. And it goes a long ways with the notified bodies when they see that you did proactively go back and update those documents after you did your clinical study. And again, benefit risk discussion paramount. Without that, your PMCF and your CER will be rejected by the notified body. And I'll close. Next slide. Maybe that's the end. There's no more. Oh, there I am. So thank you for attending. I'd like to just give a shout out for what I see happening in the EU MDR land with notified bodies, with companies preparing to register their devices in the EU. And this is very interesting, and I've been doing this for quite a few years, but I'm seeing, for example, the clinical evaluation report is a big challenge for most companies. Even large companies with many thousands of employees struggle with creating compiling clinical evaluation reports. Smaller companies obviously don't have the resources to generate a clinical evaluation report. So what I've been doing and what I'm seeing other companies do is outsource the clinical evaluation report. So I mentioned this because I'm talking to our esteemed, distinguished guests in India. I've been using, a team in Bangalore for 6 years now at 3 different companies to generate 6 different clinical evaluation reports, and they are outstanding. So the reason I say this is we're talking to biomedical engineers here. Now, some of you may be about to enter the marketplace and look for work. There's tremendous opportunities in India to work remotely for companies in the United States, helping them with their clinical evaluation reports, with their clinical evaluation plans, and certainly with their literature surveys. Like I said, I've been using a team out of Bangalore for 6 years. They are absolutely outstanding. What does it take? It takes good writing skills, medical writing skills, and an advanced degree in engineering or pharmacy or medicine. So I've been using a team in Bangalore. There's 3 other companies that I know of in India that are doing this, 4 companies in the United States. Now, in addition, if you don't want to work for a company in the United States and help them with their post-market surveillance activities, there's another avenue for working as a biomedical engineer in India, and that is working directly for the notified bodies. And the reason I bring this up is, in my current company, working with DQS, all of the notified bodies are understaffed right now. They cannot keep up with the demand for certification to the EU MDR. So what is happening? DQS is outsourcing the technical documentation assessment to biomedical engineers in India. So my latest TD assessment was performed again in Bangalore by an employee of DQS Germany who resides and works remotely out of his home in India, and in 1 week reviewed my 10,000 page technical documentation. So this is, again, another opportunity that you need to be aware of to support medical device industry from the other side, from the notified bodies side. They're currently, all of the notified bodies, I don't care if it's BSI, TUV, DQS, DECRA, NSAI, they're all looking for additional resources to help with these TD assessments. So there's another opportunity that I'd like to bring up for all of you to consider in the future. And with that, I'm going to close my presentation. Any questions? Yes.
So it was a great presentation, sir. So I have one question, sir. Like, if any company or any management doesn't follow these kind of procedure or the protocols, what are the problems they may face majorly?
What are the what that they maintain?
What are the issues they may face if they are not following these kind of procedures or protocols in a proper manner?
Well, the challenge is, and this is the real world, the larger notified bodies, and again, TUV is the largest in the world, followed by BSI, they will make your life very difficult. And let me give you an example. TUV will take your technical document and they'll break it into modules. They'll break it into 5 modules. They'll say one module is biocompatibility, one module is clinical evaluations, one module is benchtop V&V testing, one module is they'll break it into all of these modules. And if you haven't followed these protocols, if you are negligent on your statistical analysis, this assessment by a large notified body such as TUV can take 2 years. Now, some companies cannot stand for that length of time, and they'll actually go out of business. They won't be able to continue to support that ongoing investigation by the notified body. So I personally witnessed, all of the documentation submitted to TUV, say in April 2021, and the CE cert received in March 2023. So 2 years. Why? Because many of the protocols weren't followed. So there's your challenges. If you don't have the expertise in-house, absolutely go outside. There are a lot of people now that offer this support to these companies, and I would highly recommend taking advantage of the support out there, because the notified bodies don't care how small your company is. You must apply the same rules as Johnson & Johnson and Medtronic. The same EU MDR must be followed to the T. So there's no shortcuts. Just because you're a small company and only have 50 employees, you need to do the same things that the 200,000 employee companies do. So it is a challenge for the smaller companies, and I see more and more of them outsourcing these activities. Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you, sir. And one more thing, sir, like while giving a training to the students, we used to ask them like, what is your area of interest in biomedical engineering? Some of them will say that I need to study about the FDA and then about the CE and EU MDRs, like that kind of things. So what are the initial steps they need to take to study about that kind of certifications as a fresher?
Yeah, I mean, there are, as you probably know, if you're interested in this field, there are courses that you can take and certifications that you can achieve in the area of regulatory affairs where you can actually get certified. I know here in the US, many foreign students come to USC, University of Southern California, as well as Johns Hopkins, as well as Northeastern, as well as University of Chicago, specifically for these programs where you get a master's degree in regulatory affairs. I've hired 3 graduates from University of Southern California, all from India, all with bachelor's and master's degrees from Bangalore, from highly technical degrees in Bangalore. They then came to the United States and got advanced degrees in regulatory affairs at University of Southern California, and outstanding preparation for entering the regulatory field. So I would highly recommend that you consider those programs if you have the ability to do that.
Thank you, sir. So,
Yep.
faculties and participant students, if you have any kind of queries or doubts, you can ask now.
Well, thank you so much. It was a good discussion, and I hope I gave everyone something to think about. And as I, if you look at the last slide, if you want to reach out to me, if you have any information or any questions that you still have, feel free to send me an email, and I'll be happy to respond.
Yes, sir. So thank you very much, sir. Thank you for accepting our request for this international faculty development program.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And I hope that we can able to do further programs regarding this EU MDR program. Thank you very much, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, sir.